and the hidden trust. Arthur Vance sat in an orange jumpsuit, holding a dead phone receiver to his ear, staring at nothing. Behind the glass partition, his reflection was all that remained. A hollow shell of the man who had poisoned his wife and trapped his son. But that was 7 days from now. 7 days before the truth would consume everything. 13 hours earlier, the sun was climbing through the window of Elias Vance's apartment, dust motes spinning lazily in its beam. He sat on a threadbare Persian rug surrounded by cardboard boxes. The remnants of his mother's estate spread around him like evidence at a crime scene. His right hand reached into a blue tin labeled Danish Cookies, except it wasn't filled with cookies at all. Inside, coiled spools of thread caught the light, silver thimbles nested against scraps of faded fabric. The tin had belonged to his mother. She'd kept it for 63 years, bringing it with her from country to country as she followed his father's career. Now it was just another box to sort through, another piece of her life to decide. Keep or discard? His fingers brushed against something that didn't belong. Something metallic. Something beneath. He pulled out his pocket knife, the wooden-handled one his grandfather had carried, and pressed it between the tin's false bottom and the fabric scraps. The metal sheet lifted with a soft resistance, revealing a yellow manila envelope underneath. Folded twice, the paper aged to the color of old teeth. Elias opened it with trembling fingers. A single sheet of heavy bond paper fell into his lap. At the top, printed in bold black ink, 3 words stared back at him. Trust agreement. Underneath, beneficiary. Elias Vance. The date was June 12, 2005. He had been 10 years old. His eyes moved down the page, scanning past legal language he didn't fully understand, until they landed on the value column. The number was written in careful script. $450,000. Below it, 2 signatures. His father's, Arthur Vance, scrawled in blue ink with the aggression of a man who signed things without reading them. And his mother's, delicate and precise. Someone had circled the number $450,000 in red pencil. He turned the page. A yellow sticky note was attached to the back, the adhesive aged and brittle. The handwriting was his mother's, elegant, careful, the penmanship of someone from another era. It read, "Tell him nothing. He isn't ready." Elias stared at those 7 words for a full minute. His hands had stopped shaking. Now they'd gone cold. He drove to his father's house in the rain, the trust document pressed against his ribs like a knife. The steering wheel was slick under his palms. He'd rehearsed what he would say a dozen times, but the words felt useless now. Small things in his mouth. By the time he reached the mahogany door, he'd stopped rehearsing at all. His father's office was on the 2nd floor, a room that had always smelled of leather and expensive scotch. Arthur sat in his high-backed leather chair, back turned to the door, the afternoon light filtering through the gloomy windows. He was pouring scotch into a crystal tumbler when Elias entered. When Elias slammed the document down on the mahogany desk with a sound like a gunshot. The glass stuttered. Liquid sloshed against the sides. "What is this, Dad?" Elias's voice didn't sound like his own. It sounded like it belonged to someone desperate, someone caught. "What is this? $450,000 under my name since I was 10? Arthur turned the chair slowly. He looked at the paper without picking it up. He sipped his drink. His eyes were the color of winter sky, and they didn't blink. When he stood, he loomed over Elias by 4 inches, a fact he'd always used like a tool. Ice clinked in the glass. "Give me that paper, Elias," he said, his voice low and dangerous, the voice he used when he was about to hurt someone. "You weren't supposed to find that tin." Elias reached for the paper. His father's hand shot out, not to grab the document, but to seize Elias's wrist. The grip was crushing. Pain shot up his arm like electricity. He tried to pull away, but Arthur was stronger, built from a lifetime of discipline and violence. Arthur shoved him backward. Elias hit the bookcase. Several hardback novels tumbled down, their spines cracking against his head and shoulders. Before he could recover, Arthur lunged. His hands found Elias's throat, and suddenly the world was narrowing, the air tightening, the edges of his vision going purple, then black. Elias's hands flew to Arthur's forearms, his fingernails digging in, trying to find purchase on muscle and skin. He was choking. Actually choking. His father's face was inches from his own, teeth bared, breath smelling of expensive peat and tobacco. Then, just as the darkness threatened to take him completely, Arthur let go. He stepped back, breathing hard. He picked up the document from the desk and walked to the shredder, the industrial shredder beside his desk, the one he used for business secrets and tax documents. He fed the paper into the slot. The machine whined. It ate the paper in thin strips, consuming the evidence, consuming the only proof Elias had ever held. "That money isn't yours," Arthur said, his voice steady now, sadistic. "It never was. It's the price your mother paid to keep me from taking you away." Elias gasped for air. His throat felt crushed, his voice gone. He watched his father watch the last of the document disappear into the shredder. The realization hit him like a second blow. The trust wasn't an inheritance. His mother hadn't left him money. She'd paid his father off. She'd paid him to let their son live. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He lay in his apartment, a small place he could barely afford on his accountant's salary, and stared at the ceiling. At 11 p.m., he finally dragged himself to the bathroom to wash the bruises forming on his neck. He splashed cold water on his face. When he looked up at his reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror, something caught his eye. There was a red glint in the corner of the air vent above the toilet. A small, persistent red dot, blinking every 3 seconds. He stood on the toilet lid, his heart beginning to race again. He pulled the plastic vent slats back, and there it was. A wireless spy camera, no bigger than a walnut, with a small LED that pulsed like a tiny heartbeat. The brand name on the back read Vance-Tech in silver lettering, his father's security firm. Elias ripped the camera out and held it in his palm. His hands were shaking now, not from pain, but from something worse. From understanding that his apartment wasn't his anymore, that his privacy didn't exist, that he was being watched from inside his own home, from the one place he thought was safe. He was sitting in his car 3 days later, waiting in a public parking garage, when the gray sedan pulled in 2 spaces over. He'd been paranoid since finding the camera, checking his apartment for more devices, wondering what his father had already seen, what he knew. His phone had been dead for hours. He'd left it in his apartment on purpose. He was walking toward his silver sedan when the footsteps started. Echoing footsteps on hollow concrete. 2 men emerged from behind concrete pillars, both wearing tactical black vests with Vance-Tech security embroidered across the back. One carried a collapsible baton. Elias's heart stopped. They didn't say anything. They just moved toward him with the practiced efficiency of men who did this for money, who hurt people for a living. The one with the baton swung it in a lazy arc, like he was warming up. Elias ducked. The metal rod whistled inches above his hair, so close he felt the air part. He didn't think. He just drove his car keys like a dagger into the man's thigh, as hard as he could, twisting them as he pulled them out. The thug screamed and fell, one hand clutching the wound. The second man grabbed Elias from behind, his arms wrapping around Elias's torso in a bear hug that drove the air from his lungs. Elias threw his head back, hard, felt something give in the man's face. There was a crunch, the sound of cartilage breaking, and then warm blood sprayed across Elias's shoulder, dripping down his arm. He didn't stop to appreciate it. He just lunged for his car, unlocked the door with a trembling hand, threw himself inside, and locked all the doors. The two men started pounding on the glass, leaving bloody handprints on the driver's side window, their fists thudding against the metal. Elias slammed the car into reverse. Tires screeched. The garage echoed with the sound of violence. He drove to Clara's art studio without thinking about what he would say. His sister. His estranged sister. They hadn't spoken in almost a year. Not since their mother's funeral, when Clara had spent most of it drunk and Elias had spent it numb. But she was the only person who might understand. She was the only one who might know what was happening. The studio was in an old warehouse converted into artist lofts, smelling of turpentine and oil paint. Clara was standing in front of a massive canvas when he entered. A painting of a fractured family tree, the branches splitting and splintering, the leaves rendered in shades of red and black. She was wearing overalls splattered with paint, her dark hair pulled back with a turpentine-soaked cloth. Elias held up the spy camera. He'd kept it, carried it with him, and dropped it into her bowl of turpentine. Clara's brushes clattered to the floor. She stared at him for a moment, taking in his torn shirt, the blood on his shoulder, the bruises on his neck. She didn't look surprised. "What is that?" she asked. But she didn't wait for an answer. She walked to her workbench and turned her laptop around. The screen showed a grid of 6 camera feeds. One showed Elias's kitchen, one showed his bedroom from the corner, one showed his front door, one showed his bathroom from the shower, one showed his living room. One was dark. "I'm not working for him, Elias," Clara said, her voice flat and cold. "I'm making sure he doesn't kill you like he did her." The words didn't make sense. They made sense immediately. They didn't make sense at all. "What are you talking about?" Elias heard himself say. Clara pointed to her inspiration board. Among the sketches and paint swatches was a fragment of what looked like an autopsy report. The header faded, but still visible. Elias stepped closer. The words blurred and sharpened. "Cause of death. Pulmonary embolism." But beneath that, highlighted in yellow, a phrase, "Trace amounts of succinylcholine." Their mother had died of a pulmonary embolism. Everyone knew that. It had been unexpected, but not impossible. She was 58 years old, and they'd all accepted it. But succinylcholine was a muscle relaxant. It was used in anesthesia. It was used in assassinations. "How did you get this?" Elias asked. "I have contacts, investigators, people who owed me favors." Clara pulled out her phone and opened a photo gallery. Images flashed past. Their father in his office with a man in surgical scrubs. A vial labeled SUK 100. A receipt from a medical supply company dated 3 days before their mother died. "I didn't know what to do with it," Clara continued. "I didn't have proof. I just had suspicions. So I started watching. I put cameras in your apartment, your car, everywhere I could think of. I was gathering evidence." "By spying on me?" "By making sure you didn't end up like her." That night, while his father believed him asleep and under surveillance, Elias drove to the house where he'd grown up, where his mother had died, where his father kept his secrets. He parked 3 blocks away and approached on foot, staying in the shadows. The basement door was locked, but the lock was old. It took him less than a minute to pick it with a credit card and determination. He descended the wooden stairs, each one creaking under his weight. his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. At the bottom was a hallway he barely remembered. His father had forbidden him from going down here as a child. He'd said it was dangerous. He'd said there was nothing down there but old things and asbestos. He found the locked medical refrigerator behind a tool rack, just where his sister had described it in her frantic phone call. He smashed the glass door with a fire extinguisher from the wall. The glass shattered like teeth breaking. Inside, on the top shelf, were 3 small glass vials labeled UCC 100. Next to them was a leather-bound logbook. He opened it with trembling fingers. The pages were filled with his father's handwriting, dates, times, dosages. And at the front of the book, on the inside cover, his mother's name was written in careful script. Margaret Vance. Target profile. Elias didn't hear the footsteps behind him until it was too late. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out," his father said. Arthur Vance stood at the bottom of the basement stairs, and he wasn't alone. Clara stood beside him, holding a stack of $100 bills wrapped in a rubber band. Her eyes were fixed on the concrete floor. Arthur was holding a shotgun. "Everyone has a price, Elias," Arthur said, his voice booming in the small space. "Even artistic integrity. Even a daughter who pretends to love her family." Clara stepped forward. Her silk skirt rustled. She reached into Elias's pocket and pulled out the vials he'd just stolen from the refrigerator. She handed them to Arthur without meeting her brother's eyes. Then everything happened at once. Elias tackled his father, and they went down hard onto the concrete. The shotgun skittered across the floor. They slid toward the stairs, tumbling down 3 steps before Elias managed to get on top. He punched Arthur in the throat with all the strength he had left. Arthur responded by slamming the shotgun butt into Elias's ribs, and something inside him cracked. Actually cracked, and he heard himself scream. Arthur pinned him against the bottom step, his hands moving toward his pocket. Elias saw the vial there, saw what his father intended to do. Inject him with the same poison he'd used on their mother. Make it look like another tragic heart attack in the family. Elias grabbed Arthur's wrist and twisted it with a movement born from pure desperation, twisting it until the bone snapped. The sound was wet and clear, a pop followed by a crack. Arthur screamed. He screamed loud enough that the foundation seemed to vibrate, but he didn't let go. His other hand grabbed Elias's ankle and dragged him back, dragged him across the concrete. He picked up a heavy brass lamp from a side table. When had there been a side table? And swung it at Elias's head. Elias rolled away. The lamp connected with the concrete where his head had been a microsecond before, and the impact sent sparks flying. He scrambled to his feet and ran up the stairs 3 at a time. Behind him, his father was coming too, still screaming, still moving despite the broken wrist, still pursuing him with the single-mindedness of a predator who'd tasted blood. Elias burst out of the basement and into the house. Behind him, the basement door slammed shut and locked from the outside. He ran through the hallway toward his father's study, threw himself inside, and locked the heavy oak door behind him. He could hear Arthur pounding on the door, shouting things Elias couldn't make out over his own ragged breathing. Then the pounding stopped. Elias moved to the window. Outside, 3 black SUVs were pulling up the driveway, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Men in dark uniforms were already climbing out. His father had called them. Not the real police. Never the real police. These were his people. Vance-Tech security, federal contractors, men who owed him favors and money. Men who could make a problem disappear. Elias checked his phone. No signal. A jammer. Active. He reached into his sock where he'd hidden a small digital recorder, the one he'd been planning to use to capture his father's confession. But the screen was cracked, the components shattered. His ribs screamed with pain as he lifted his shirt. The left side was already turning purple, the bruises spreading like ink in water. He was trapped. The window was reinforced plexiglass. The door was solid oak, locked from his side but wouldn't hold against the men who were now climbing the stairs. There was no way out. Then he remembered his mother's voice, the sound of her reading to him when he was small, the sound of her stories. The lion's ear. She'd told him that story 100 times. A magical tale about a secret door hidden in a lion's face, a way out when there was no way out. He looked at his father's fireplace, the carved mahogany fireplace that dominated the study's north wall. And there, carved into the stone surround, was a lion's head. Its mouth was open in a roar, its eye was blank marble, its ear was within reach. Elias stuck his finger into the carved ear and pulled. The mechanism was surprisingly smooth. The back panel of the fireplace slid open with a sound like distant thunder, revealing a narrow, dusty chute. He could see the glint of metal railings inside, the suggestion of a long tunnel descending into darkness. He didn't hesitate. He squeezed his body into the opening just as his office door was kicked open by the men in uniforms. The sky was turning orange and pink and gold. He ran toward the town square, toward the lights that were beginning to flicker on, toward people and noise and the possibility of salvation. The Channel 5 news van was parked near the fountain, the crew setting up for the morning broadcast. Elias sprinted toward them, his lungs burning, his shirt torn and soaked with blood. He pulled the USB drive from his pocket, the drive that had been taped to the bottom of the money stack Clara had given to their father, the drive she'd somehow slipped back to him during the struggle in the basement. He didn't waste time explaining. He just thrust the drive at the nearest technician and gasped. "Play this, now, on every screen. Broadcast it." The technician looked at him like he was insane. But something in Elias's eyes, something desperate and true, made her plug the drive into the broadcast console without argument. Every screen in the town square blazed to life. The early morning crowd, joggers, delivery drivers, a few homeless people seeking warmth, all stopped and stared. They were looking at night vision footage, grainy and green, but clear enough. Clear enough to see Arthur Vance in his study, a syringe in his hand, moving toward a sleeping woman in a bed. Clear enough to see the needle go into her arm. Clear enough to see him wait, watching her, and then walk calmly from the room. Their mother. He was injecting their mother. The broadcast lasted 90 seconds before the police, the real police, the ones who'd seen the broadcast on their own screens, arrived. By then, 3 more news vans had pulled up. By then, the story was spreading, bleeding out into the world like a wound that wouldn't close. Arthur Vance was arrested within the hour, found in his basement trying to destroy the remaining evidence. He'd managed to break his left wrist in the fight with Elias, and the fracture made it difficult for him to move quickly. The police found him sitting on the concrete floor, surrounded by vials and logbooks, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in a single night. 1 week later, Elias and Clara stood on a beach at dawn. This was where their mother's ashes had been scattered 3 years ago, in a ceremony that had felt like a lie. The waves were cold and gray. The sand was empty, except for them. Elias held a small bank card in his hand. The real trust fund, finally unlocked after years of being tied up in legal battles and his father's control. $450,000. The price his mother had paid to keep their father from taking her son. Elias looked at the card for a long moment, then snapped it in half. The plastic cracked with a sound like bone breaking. He tossed the pieces into the waves. We don't need his blood money to be a family, he said. Clara took his hand. They stood together, watching the pieces of the card float on the dark water, slowly disappearing beneath the surface. Above them, the sky was beginning to brighten. The first birds were starting to sing. They turned away from the water and began to walk. Behind them, a single white flower, something delicate and lost, floated in a shallow tide pool, moving gently with the current, going nowhere and everywhere at once.